Good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining the Bridges Rental Assistance Program Request for Proposals information session. My name is Ellie Miller. I'm the program manager for Bridges, and I'm joined today by Gary Travis with the Minnesota Department of Human Services. Gary, do you want to go ahead and introduce yourself?
Sure. Good morning, Ellie, and everybody else. Gary Travis, he, him pronouns, with the Minnesota Department of Human Services Behavioral Health Division. Good to see everybody here.
DHS and Minnesota Housing work collaboratively to manage the Bridges and Bridges RTC program. Today's presentation is approximately 30 minutes. The remaining time will be used for questions. This is going to be a very scripted presentation done intentionally so that everybody receives the same information. Because it's scripted, I will be presenting off screen and focusing on the information. So we'll check back in visually at the end of the presentation. Next slide. Minnesota Housing's mission is to provide access to safe, decent, affordable housing and build stronger communities across the state by offering products and services to help Minnesotans buy and fix up their homes and stabilize neighborhoods, communities, and families. Minnesota Housing also supports the development and preservation of affordable rental housing through both the financing and long-term asset management of projects and developments. The agency has also pioneered a successful model for supportive housing that helps stabilize the lives of some of the state's most vulnerable citizens. Next slide. The presentation will cover the following topics today: an overview of Bridges and Bridges RTC programs, the application, submission tips, and finally, there will be a time to submit questions. This is a recorded webinar and it will be posted to the website. Because it's an information session, we will collect questions in the chat and question box and then address them in the FAQ. That will also be posted to the website. Next slide. Some of you might be new to GoTo technology, so I'll explain some of the toolbar options that will be useful for today. The toolbar on the upper right-hand side of your screen allows you to ask questions using the questions feature, which I'm showing on my screen in the orange box. At any time during the webinar, you can type your question and click the send button. The questions you send will land in the queue and we will respond to them by an FAQ that will be posted to our website. In the red rectangle is the hand raising feature. When you click on the hand icon, it's the same as raising your hand as if you were in an in-person audience. We can then call on you verbally and unmute your phone line so that you can speak to the panelists. Everyone on today's broadcast will hear the dialogue through the webinar audio. Today, we'll call on audience members as we see hands being raised, but we will limit the questions to just clarifying the presentation. Again, questions about the RFP should be written in the text box in questions or chat for the FAQ. There are also a couple of options to listen to the presentation, which are indicated in the blue box. You can listen through your computer. If you choose this option, I recommend using headphones to get the clearest broadcast. You can also choose to listen using the telephone. A dial number, access code, and audio pin are provided. The audio pin is required if you plan on using the hand raising feature. This is so that we can unmute your line if needed. As I mentioned, you can ask questions using the questions box. We will respond to your questions with an FAQ posted to the website. Next slide. I'm now going to get into some of the basic overview of the program. Next slide. Bridges and Bridges RTC will be a combined RFP. The grant cycle for both programs is a 2-year grant cycle beginning July 1st, 2023 and ending June 30, 2025. Any defined terms in this presentation are capitalized and can be found in the RFP instructions, which are posted on the Minnesota Housing website in the Bridges page. Funds are awarded through a competitive RFP process, and funds will be utilized up to $11,500,000 in grants from 2 sources. The available funding may be adjusted as it's contingent on the amount awarded from the Minnesota Legislature and Minnesota Department of Human Services. The Bridges grants do not include funds to provide supportive housing services. Next slide. New applicants are encouraged to apply. Eligible Bridges applicants must be a housing agency, which is a housing authority, tribal nation, or nonprofit organization. Housing agencies that are currently subcontracting with agencies to serve the region are encouraged to discuss their current contract with their local mental health entity and decide if people would be better served if the subgrantees had their own grants, counties within the service area. Next slide. In order to be eligible, the application must also include a partnership with a local mental health entity. Behavioral health service partners are an additional focus and will be included in the cooperative agreement in a highlighted way. A more detailed training on cooperative agreements and partnerships will be included in the due diligence training later in this schedule. Not today in this training, but as the RFP process moves on. Cooperative agreements will not be due at the due diligence phase, but after the grant contract agreements are signed. Next slide. The application requires the responsibility of both the Bridges Housing Agency and the local mental health entity to successfully respond. The local mental health entity can be the following: a local mental health authority operating under the authority of the county, a tribal nation mental health agency operating under the authority of the tribal government, or an adult mental health initiative, which is a collaboration of the county's local mental health authorities and/or tribal nation mental health agencies that provide or enhances coordination of the delivery of mental health services required under the Minnesota Adult Mental Health Act. Next slide. Eligible participants must meet the MI definition in statute. The MI definition is in line with the statute. The SMI definition is in line with the statute and is not intended to exclude people with serious mental illness from the program. For current housing agencies, the verification form has been altered for the next contract term to be clear about this definition. Gary, do you want to talk a little bit more about this definition?
Certainly. Minnesota does not have a specific definition for serious mental illness. The definition of mental illness identifies that mental illness seriously limits a person's capacity to function in primary aspects of daily living, such as personal relations, living arrangements, work, and recreation. Persons with serious and persistent mental illness are included in the mental illness definition. Additionally, the participant must be eligible to receive a housing choice voucher or other housing option by the time they exit the Bridges program. If they have barriers that can be reduced while in the program, they are eligible.
The last eligibility is that they must meet the income eligibility at the time of initial entrance to the program, being at or below 50% of the area median income for the household size. Next slide. Bridges housing agencies must give priority to the following populations. Highest priority given to the people living in an institution, segregated setting, or under correctional supervision who will be homeless upon exit. A well-established relationship should be in place with coordinated entry, and a process of receiving applicants experiencing homelessness should be in place. For justice-involved households, well-established relationships that serve this population should be in place or in development. Gary, can you touch a little bit on the service partnerships?
Certainly. It's important to clearly identify the service partnership and resources that will be provided in order to support the level of services needed.
Next slide. Under the Bridges RTC program, an eligible participant is a person that's defined with mental illness who is eligible for Bridges and who is referred from the institutions listed above and who have significant and complex housing barriers. Gary, do you want to talk a bit about how to identify services that will address
Yes.
barriers?
Identify how the services will address the significant complex barriers. Be specific in your description on these services and how they'll be coordinated.
Next slide. Here's a bit more about the Regional Treatment Center RTC sources specifically. Gary, do you want to talk about this section?
Certainly, Ellie. Bridges RTC is designed to help participants move from the hospitalization at one of the state's specified operated facilities to living in an integrated setting in the community of the participant's choice. Referrals may come directly from the Anoka Metro Regional Treatment Center, AMRTC, or St. Peter Regional Treatment Center, now being called Forensic Services. A local mental health entity or other agencies may also make referrals. Individuals are often diverted from regional treatment centers before entering or exiting facilities for treatment or other locations. Identified participants may transition to intensive residential treatment service facilities or other treatment facilities prior to community housing and still retain their eligibility for Bridges RTC. Applicable sections in the Bridges program guide will clarify this transition period by stating that identified participants remain eligible if the individual has a legal commitment court document that has been verified and documented in the file. The period of time diverted from Anoka Metro Regional Treatment Center or St. Peter Regional Treatment Center or other treatment facility is not relevant. Ellie?
Next slide. The eligible uses funds include payments to assist with housing people with barriers. Other resources in the community should be used first, and then Bridges resources. For this next contract term, financial assurance and risk mitigation programs have been added to the eligible uses. Next slide. At the time of selection for funding, Minnesota Housing will approve a monthly administration fee. It will be described in the Bridges and Bridges RTC grant contract agreement. The administration fee will be paid each month in which a participant resides in an eligible assisted unit. The fee is based on the target number of households, the amount of the grant, the geography of the service area and population served, and other relevant criteria. Current applicants must reapply with their current administration fee that may be approved by Minnesota Housing Board to be adjusted by inflation, which will be described in the next slide. New applicants must propose their admin fee based on the described criteria in the program guide. Next slide. The administration fee for the 2024-25 grant period will be published on Friday, January 27th, 2023, which is after this posting of the RFP. It'll be posted on the Minnesota Housing Bridges RFP website. The administration fee published on that day will be no less than the current administration fee, which ranges from $53 to $68 per person per month. When completing the application, waiting until the new admin fee amounts are published will be important for your application. Next slide. Bridges grantees are required to participate in local mental health entity meetings at least twice a year and must have a collaborative working relationship with the local mental health entity in order to best serve people with mental illness who are experiencing housing instability. Each activity is carried out by the Bridges grantee, the local mental health entity, and now the behavioral health service partners as well. Some duties might be covered by multiple entities. Responsibilities vary for different implementation and must be described in the cooperative agreement. Behavioral health entities and entities that provide housing stabilization services need to be identified in the agreement and resources identified as well. These individual providers are not included as signers in the cooperative agreement. Gary? Looks like we may have lost Gary.
Oh, my apologies. This active partnership helps to meet the housing mission statement of the Comprehensive Adult Mental Health Act.
Next slide. Behavioral health service partners and service partners that provide housing stabilization services in the area must be identified. The resources to provide services must also be identified. Although these services are still just emerging in all areas of the state, identifying who they are in your service area is important to the service delivery. Next slide. Bridges RTC must have the endorsement of the local mental health initiative and a cooperative agreement with a behavioral health service provider. Each organization's roles and responsibilities must be clearly outlined. Next slide. The applicant should also partner with organizations that are working to create culturally appropriate practices that help ensure effective identification and service delivery for participants. In addition, applicants should provide training as well as implement staffing, housing, and service models that are proven to provide results for people with mental illness and households with high barriers to housing. The annual progress report is an expectation of the housing agency. Next slide. We'll get into the details of the application. Next slide. The goal of the application scoring methodology are to incentivize housing agencies to be high-performing agencies that strive to serve Bridges participants in the best way possible, and that track their outcomes to continue to improve program practices.
It's important to also remember the Bridges RTC focus on the priority population that's identified.
Next slide. The total possible score equals 100 points for Bridges applicants and 105 for Bridges RTC applicants. Because new applicants will not have a score for prior performance, they are asked to provide answers to 4 additional questions in the application. The answers will be used to determine a performance score for the new applicant. The following tables in the next slide highlight the points for each application category as well as performance. The application has 5 sections for all applicants. Each section will be reviewed today in the presentation. Applicants applying for RTC have 1 additional section, as do new applicants. Each existing have a performance section that they will be scored on. The priority populations is the first section in the scoring methodology. Bridges is designed to assist people with high needs through the provision of a housing subsidy that is linked with community mental health services. To achieve this goal, housing agencies must give highest priority to the people residing in an institution or other segregated setting who will be homeless upon discharge. It was back in 2015 that the Bridges priority shifted from just homeless populations to people exiting institutions. Next slide. The program design and implementation is the next section in the scoring methodology. An applicant must have the ability to serve the region named in the application and have resources available to move participants to permanent subsidies. Programs that monitor utilization and have administrators that prioritize permanent subsidies for Bridges participants tend to have positive outcomes. Next slide. Diversity and inclusion is the next section. Bridges is intended to serve people with mental illness. Applicants also should be serving diverse populations and creating strategies to reach underserved populations and groups disparately impacted by homelessness. Next slide. Foundational service practices identify areas of program implementation believed to have the greatest potential to positively impact outcomes for people experiencing homelessness. The goals of the service practices are to establish standards that more effectively serve individuals and families who experience challenges in accessing and maintaining participation in the program. The foundational service practices are related to documents required for enrollment, frequency of required in-person appointments, mailing address and phone number requirements, communication methods, criminal history, and documenting housing status. The last section for all grantees is services. Applications must have good collaborative partners and have service models in place that create choice for participants and assist them in housing stability and the transition to a permanent subsidy. Next slide. The scoring methodology section for Bridges RTC only is completed if you're applying for RTC. RTC must complete all the applicant areas of the application and will also be scored on these few separate questions that are specific to the RTC program. RTC applicants can score a maximum of 105 points. Next slide. Current housing agencies must complete all the applicant areas and will be scored based on your current performance. You do not need to submit anything for this section other than the information requested in the Bridges Budget Workbook. Minnesota Housing will complete a performance review and submit the information for scoring. After the grant review committee has met and the scores have been finalized, state agency staff may incorporate the scores into final funding recommendations. That may be also based on geographic distribution, services to special populations, and the applicant's history as a state grantee and capacity to perform the work. Final funding amounts will be dependent on the amount requested, the number of applicants, and the amount available to distribute. Applicants with scores below 50 points may not be funded, or they may be given conditional funding and be required to receive technical assistance. Decisions are at Minnesota Housing's sole discretion. Additionally, Minnesota Housing serves the right to request proposals during the due diligence phase. Request proposal revisions during the due diligence phase of the contract period, which is after Minnesota Housing's board approval, but before the grant contract agreement is executed. Next slide. We're going to go ahead and show the Bridges Budget Workbook just to give individuals a chance to see the workbook and the individual tabs. I'll step through each of the tabs so that people are aware of what tabs need to be completed when you're applying. So the first tab is the Instructions tab, and this may be a tab that you commonly refer back to. It tries to step through each individual request in the tab and give some more detail to help you complete the workbook in a way that is fully complete. The next tab is Contact Information. This is to make sure that we have the appropriate information regarding the agency and the contact information for the agency applying, and then also the mental health initiative or service partner information that you're co-applying with. And I think the rest of it is fairly self-explanatory, the remainder of partners that might be relevant that we may need to contact. The Bridges summary is for all folks that are applying, whether you're applying for Bridges by itself or Bridges RTC as well. So this one needs to be completed. And then the next tab is the Utilization tab, which is going to sort of give us an idea of how you arrived at the amount of funding that you're asking for. I want to note that on this Bridges Utilization, in the top corner, there's some red triangles. Those are some notes that I'll get into some more detail about things to remember when you're completing those sections of the utilization report. The next tab is the RTC summary, which only needs to be completed if you are applying for Bridges RTC. And then again, if you're applying for Bridges RTC, you complete the utilization form to help us know how you arrived at the amount that you're asking for. If you're not applying for Bridges RTC and only applying for Bridges, you do not need to complete either of the RTC tabs. The next tab is for the current housing agency. So if you're currently a housing agency that's providing Bridges rental assistance with Minnesota Housing, these questions you need to answer. And the same thing, the next tab is the RTC current grantees need to complete that tab. I think that is it for the workbook. Next slide. So in the workbook, I alluded to some red triangles to be mindful of when completing the utilization form. And I'm going to get into what those new program changes are that may affect your budget for the next contract term. Next slide. So the first change that will start in the next contract term is the maximum rent. We proposed and received approval for a two-tier change to the maximum rental subsidy limit, which will affect your budgets. So the first tier is the housing agency may implement a rental subsidy limit that allows for you to choose between the use of the fair market rent or the local payment standard, whichever is greater. The language before was the FMR or LPS, whichever is less, but now you may take the greater of the two. In addition to that, you'd be allowed to exceed that limit by 10% for up to 20% of your portfolio. Next slide. The second tier to the maximum rent is it allows housing agencies to petition in writing to Minnesota Housing to request a maximum rental subsidy increase greater than 10% and or have the increase be applicable to even more than 20% of your portfolio. Such requests must further demonstrate hardship by sending things to Minnesota Housing related to participant instability to secure housing, even with expanded subsidy time limits, etc. Just details that really further demonstrate the hardship in your service area. Evidence of these, of comparable, 3 comparable rents must be included in the petition as well. All of the tier 2 is subject to additional discussion and will be reviewed by Minnesota Housing Program Manager and our Clearinghouse Committee for approval. I bring the maximum rent change in the next contract term to your attention because it will impact the budget and it will be the discretion of the housing agency applying to determine how you utilize the change in maximum rent for your service area. Next slide. Another change that will affect your budget is Bridges historically have not had a utility allowance in the rental calculation, and not having a utility allowance creates barriers when participants transfer to a housing choice voucher or other housing option. Housing agencies have asked for this change to make the transition to other rental assistance programs easier for Bridges participants. So we will be adding a utility allowance to the calculation in the next contract term, but just note that this will also impact your budget by increasing the amount of subsidy needed per unit. Next slide. As mentioned earlier, we've added an additional allowable expense in the financial assurance risk mitigation category. And the purpose of this fee is to help support participants get into housing. The fee is paid by the participant or an organization on behalf of the participant and is now an eligible expense. So something to consider, again, as you complete the eligible household expenses part of your budget to, if you plan on using this as an agency to support participants, to allow for that in your budget. Next slide. The application checklist has the following items: the application signature page, the budget workbook, which we just went through in detail. Next slide. A copy of the current local payment standard for your service area, and the affirmative action certificate form. Next slide. If you're applying and are a non-governmental entity, you must provide your financial statements. The type of financial statement you provide is related to your agency's overall budget, not the amount you're applying for in this application, but rather how much the applicant's agency has in total gross revenue in a given year. Next slide. Most of you will be applying for more than $100,000, so this will apply to you. You will need to determine if you are subject to the Minnesota Human Rights Act. Completing the affirmative action form is important. In addition, you also need to provide documentation of compliance if the box you check on the form indicates that you need to do so. Next slide. If you are selected for funding, you will be required to submit due diligence items. In prior bienniums, we were given some leeway on the execution date of the grant contract amendments, meaning they could be executed after July 1 and still be retroactive to July 1. This is no longer allowable. Thus, all required due diligence items must be submitted to us by Wednesday, June 7th, 2023, in order to execute the grant contract agreement by July 1st. If due diligence items are late, we will have to execute your grant contract agreement as of the time that we receive the approved items, which means your grant contract amendment will not be retroactive. Any payments made after July 1 without a signed grant contract agreement will not be reimbursed. Next slide. There is a sample cooperative agreement on the Minnesota Housing website on the Bridges page. If you're applying for Bridges and Bridges RTC, you will need to have two separate cooperative agreements for these grants. The waiting list selection plan is also needs to be included, and the EFT form has gone through a few changes, which will be highlighted in the FAQ. Next slide. You will also see this timeline in the RFP instructions, but I wanted to provide the timeline for the RFP. Applications must be submitted by Tuesday, February 14th at 12 p.m. noon Central Time. Minnesota Housing staff will make recommendations to the Minnesota Housing Board on Thursday, April 27th, and those selected should receive notification of the board's decision by Friday, April 28th. If awarded funds, we will then enter the due diligence phase, and selected agencies will be expected to submit back to us those due diligence items we discussed earlier. As mentioned previously, in prior bienniums, we were given some leeway to execute on the execution date of the grant contract agreements, which meant they could be executed after July 1 and still be retroactive. Just again, a reminder, this is no longer allowable. Thus, all of the required due diligence items must be submitted to us no later than Wednesday, June 7th, 2023, in order for us to execute a grant contract agreement by July 1st, 2023. If due diligence items are late, we will have to execute your grant contract agreement as of that time we receive the approved items, which means your grant contract agreement will not be retroactive. Next slide. Submission tips, next slide. All application materials must be submitted in their original format to the secure upload tool, which can be found on our website. Instructions on how to use the secure upload tool can also be found on our website. Next slide. I can't emphasize enough the importance of submitting the right documents with the right information. On the day that we receive applications, our staff must ensure that the application meets threshold criteria. This happens before we review the application materials in their entirety and before we hand off applications to reviewers to score. Everyone should highlight these bullets because if you do not complete one of these tasks, your application could be rejected before it's even reviewed. Submit the application no later than Tuesday, February 14th at noon Central Time, and make sure every question in the application is complete. Next slide. Remember that you can ask questions using the questions box, and we will respond to your questions with an FAQ posted to the Minnesota Housing's website. I'm going to come back on screen. Thank you everybody again for attending, for participating today. We'll hang out for a minute and allow any questions that you have to come into the questions box. If anybody has any questions regarding the presentation itself, feel free to raise your hand and we can unmute you and clarify any of the material that was presented today. And again, thank you for attending. We'll go off camera and be watching for questions to come in. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
It looks like we do have one hand raised. Gary, you're unmuted, so if you unmute yourself, you can ask that question.
Go ahead, Gary.
I'm actually not seeing. Oh, sorry, my apologies. Clicked the wrong button.
I think the question is Gary
I
Lloyd.
think Gary Lloyd, yeah. Gary Lloyd, you can go ahead if you still have a question. Sorry for the confusion.
Okay, can you hear me?
I can.
Okay. I just want to be clear on the cooperative agreements. I think you said there's two separate cooperative agreements, one for bridges, one for bridges RTC. Last round, we combined them and clearly separated, the definitions and the eligibility components for each. That's no longer okay. We want two separate for each county.
That's correct.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome. There are some other questions that are basic information that I can go ahead and answer. Sherry, to your point, will we provide forms for the utility allowance? And yes, we will. We'll provide a new rental assistance calculation form, as well as provide some training for staff on how to use that new rental calculation form. It looks like Sherry's also asking for a little bit more information related to shared housing. And we didn't get into that content today because it's not going to affect your budgets in a significant way like the other new items that I talked about related to the contract term. But I will just mention briefly, and we will provide more information as we get closer to the contract term, that shared housing is now an allowable expense to be used with rental assistance funds for bridges. And we'll have full definitions of what shared housing is as we get closer to the contract term. Let's see. Looks like Don has some very specific questions related to the application. So Don, I'm going to include those in the FAQ to make sure that everybody gets the same information related to the application. And that is it that I'm seeing. So we will post all the responses in the FAQ as well as verbally here that I answered today to give everybody, but when they're really specific to the application, I want to make sure that I don't answer it off the cuff, that I take the time to write those down so everybody gets the same info. Okay, looks like Sherry, you have an additional question. I'm wondering if you could come off mute. Meredith, can we get Sherry off mute so I can better understand the question that she's asking? The input that is asked of the participants on the program review, will this be looked at by housing? Would verbal conversation be accepted, or should we develop a survey? Can you further define what you're asking there, Sherry?
Yeah, I noticed that there's a section on the RFP that states that they want more input from our participants in order for us to review our program and identify our areas of strength and improvement.
Okay.
So I was just wondering, is this something that we need to either could we just have a verbal conversations, because we have done that in the past, but we have not made like a survey. And I was just wondering, is this something that may be looked at if we're audited in a client's file?
Okay. Good, I'll look into that and make sure that I include that information in the FAQ. Thank you for the question.
Thank you.
Okay, again, we will stay online for a few more minutes. If there are some last minute questions that trickle in, feel free to enter them in the question box. Sherry, I see your additional question that has come in. We'll make sure to address that in the FAQ as well.
Thank you.
Okay, Meredith, I think we've got all of the questions that will be coming in if we want to go ahead and end the webinar. Thanks again, everybody, for attending.